Eyre, Chapter 5, Part 2. The refectory was a great, low-ceiled, gloomy room on two long tables, smoked basins of something hot, which, however, to my dismay, sent forth an odor far from inviting. I saw a universal manifestation of discontent, which the fumes of the repast met the nostrils of those destined to swallow it. From the van of the procession, the tall girls of the first class rose the whispered words, "Disgusting! The porridge is burnt again!" "Silence!" ejaculated a voice. Not that of Miss Miller, but one of the upper teachers, a little and dark personage, smartly dressed, but of somewhat morose aspect, who installed herself at the top of one table, while a more buxom lady presided at the other. I looked in vain for her. I had seen that night before. She was not visible. Miss Miller occupied the foot of the table where I sat, and a strange, foreign-looking elderly lady, the French teacher, as I afterwards found, took the corresponding seat at the other board. A long grace was said and a hymn sung. Then a servant brought in some tea for the teachers, and the meal began. Ravenous, and now very faint, I devoured a spoonful or two of my portion without thinking of its taste. But the first edge of hunger blunted, I perceived I had got in hand a nauseous mess. Burnt porridge is almost as bad as rotten tomatoes. Famine itself soon sickens over it. The spoons were moved slowly. I saw each girl taste her food and try to swallow it, but in most cases the effort was soon relinquished. Breakfast was over, and none was breakfasted. Thanks had returned for what we had not got, and a second hymn chanted. The refectory was evacuated for the schoolroom. I was one of the last to go out, and in passing the tables, I saw our one teacher take a basin of the porridge and taste it. She looked at the others. All their countenance expressed displeasure, and one of them, the stout one, whispered, "Abominable stuff, how shameful!" A quarter of an hour passed before lessons again began, during which the schoolroom was in a glorious tumult. For that space of time it seemed to be permitted to talk loud and more freely, and they used their privilege. The whole conversation ran on the breakfast, which one had all but abused roundly. Poor things, it was the sole consolation they had. Miss Miller was now the only teacher in the room. A group of great girls standing about her spoke with serious and sullen gestures. I heard the name of Mr. Brocklehurst pronounced by some lips, at which Miss Miller shook her head disapprovingly, but she made no great effort to check the general wrath. Doubtless she shared in it. A clock in the schoolroom struck 9. Miss Miller left her circle and, standing in the middle of the room, cried, "Silence! To your seats!" Discipline prevailed. In 5 minutes the confused throng was resolved into order, and comparative silence quelled the babel clamor of tongues. The upper teachers now punctually resumed their posts, but still all seemed to wait. Ranged on benches down the sides of the room, the 80 girls sat motionless and erect. A quaint assemblage they appeared, all with plain locks combed from their faces, not a curl visible, in brown dresses made high and surrounded by a narrow tucker about the throat, with little pockets of holland shaped like a Highlander's purse tied in front of their frocks and designed to serve the purpose of a work bag. All too weary woolen stockings and country-made shoes, fastened with brass buckles. Above 20 of those clad in the costume were full-grown girls, or rather young women. It suited them ill and gave an air of oddity even to the prettiest. I was still looking at them and also at intervals examining the teacher, none of whom precisely pleased me, for the stout one was a little coarse, the dark one a little not fierce, the foreigner harsh and grotesque, and Miss Miller, poor thing, looked purple, weather-beaten, and overworked. When, as my eye wandered from face to face, the whole school rose simultaneously as if moved by a common spring. What was the matter? I had heard no order given. I was puzzled. Ere I had gathered my wits, the class were again seated, but as all eyes were now turned to one point, mine followed the general direction and encountered the personage who had received my last night. She stood at the bottom of the long room on her hearth, for there was a fire at each end. She surveyed the 2 rows of girls silently and gravely. Miss Miller, approaching, seemed to ask her a question, and having received her answer, went back to her place and said aloud, "Monitor of the first class, fetch the globes." While the direction was being executed, the lady consulted moved slowly up the room. I suppose I have a considerable organ of veneration, for I retain yet the sense of admiring awe with which my eyes traced her steps. Seen now in broad daylight, she looked tall, fair, and shapely. Brown eyes with a benignant light in their irids, and a fine penciling of long lashes round relieved the whiteness of her large front. On each of her temples her hair, of a very dark brown, was clustered in round curls, according to the fashion of those times, when neither smooth bands nor long ringlets were in vogue. Her dress, also in the modes of the day, was of purple cloth, relieved by a sort of Spanish trimming of black velvet. A gold watches were not so common then as now, shone at her girdle. Let the reader add, to complete the picture, refined features, a complexion, if pale, clear, and a stately air and carriage, and he will have at least, as clearly as words can give it, a correct idea of the exterior of Miss Temple. Maria Temple, as I afterwards saw the name written in a prayer book entrusted to me to carry to church. The superintendent of Lowood, for such was this lady, having taken her seat before a pair of globes, placed on one of the tables, summoned the first class round her, and commenced giving a lesson in geography. The lower classes were called by the teachers. Repetitions in history, grammar, etc. went on for an hour. Writing and arithmetic succeeded, and music lessons were given by Miss Temple to some of the elder girls. The duration of each lesson was measured by the clock, which at last struck 12. The superintendent rose. "I have a word to address to the pupils," said she. The tumult of cessation from lessons was already breaking forth, but it sank at her voice. She went on. "You had this morning a breakfast which you could not eat. You must be hungry. I have ordered that a lunch of bread and cheese shall be served to all." The teachers looked at her with a sort of surprise. "It is to be done on my responsibility," she added in an explanatory tone to them, and immediately afterwards left the room. The bread and cheese was presently brought in and distributed to the high delight and refreshment of the whole school. The order was now given to the garden. Each put on a coarse straw bonnet with strings of colored calico and a cloak of gray frieze. I was similarly equipped, and, following the stream, I made my way into the open air. The garden was a wide enclosure, surrounded with walls so high as to exclude every glimpse of prospect. A covered veranda ran down one side, and broad walks bordered a middle space divided into scores of little beds. These beds were assigned as gardens for the pupils to cultivate, and each bed had an owner. When full of flowers, they would doubtless look pretty, but now, at the latter end of January, all was wintry blight and a brown decay. I shuddered as I stood and looked round me. It was an inclement day for our outdoor exercise, not positively rainy, but darkened by a drizzling yellow fog. All underfoot was still soaking wet with the floods of yesterday. The stronger among the girls ran about and engaged in active games, but sundry pale and thin ones herded together for shelter and warmth in the veranda, and amongst these, as the dense mists penetrated to their shivering frames, I heard frequently the sound of a hollow cough. As yet I had spoken to no one, nor did anybody seem to take notice of me. I stood lonely enough, but to that feeling of isolation I was accustomed. It did not oppress me much. I leant against a pillar of the veranda, drew my gray mantle close about me, and, trying to forget the cold which nipped me without and the unsatisfied hunger which gnawed me within, delivered myself up to the employment of watching and thinking. My reflections were too undefined and fragmentary to merit record. I hardly yet knew where I was. Gateshead and my past life seemed floated away to an immeasurable distance. The present was vague and strange, and of the future I could form no conjecture. I looked round the convent-like garden, and then up at the house, a large building, half of which seemed gray and old, the other half quite new. The new part, containing the schoolroom and dormitory, was lit by the mullioned and latticed windows, which gave it a church-like aspect. A stone tablet over the door bore this inscription: Lowood Institution. This portion was rebuilt by A.D. by Naomi Brocklehurst of Brocklehurst Hall in this country. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. St. Matthew, verse 16. I read these words over and over again. I felt that an explanation belonged to them, and was unable fully to penetrate their import. I was still pondering the signification of institution, and endeavoring to make out a connection between the first words and the verse of Scripture, when the sound of a cough close behind me made me turn my head. I saw a girl sitting on a stone bench. She had bent over a book, on the perusal of which she seemed intent. From where I stood I could see the title. It was Rassalis, a name that struck me as strange and consequently attractive. In turning a leaf, she happened to look up, and I said to her directly, "Is your book interesting?" I had already formed the intention of asking her to lend it to me some day. "I like it," she answered, after a pause or a second or two, during which she examined me. "What is it about?" I continued. I hardly know where I found the handihood thus to open a conversation with a stranger. The step was contrary to my nature and habits, but I think her occupation touched a chord of sympathy somewhere, for I too liked reading, though of a frivolous and childish kind. I could not digest art or comprehend the serious or substantial. "You may look at it," replied the girl, offering the book. I did so. A brief examination convinced me that the contents were less taking than the title. Rassalis looked dull to my trifling taste. I saw nothing about fairies, nothing about genii. No bright varieties seemed spread over and closely printed pages. I returned it to her. She received it quietly, and without saying anything, she was about to relapse into her former studious mode. Again, I ventured to disturb her.